So the NCC is defined as the following. Quest for Consciousness in glossary defines it as follows. First, that it's a minimal set of neural mechanisms or events jointly sufficient for specific conscious percept or experience. And this is what the book is about. Okay, so the point here that is important to note is the word minimal, and also jointly sufficient, and also a specific conscious percept or conscious experience. By this, what they wanted to get is the fact that, for example, retina is not the minimum set of the neural mechanism, and also it's not jointly sufficient. By that, what I mean is that, for example, I gave an example of the saccadic suppression in the last week. During the saccadic suppression, your eyes move, and then you don't see what's going on outside of the vision during the saccade, and also preceding a little bit from the onset of the saccade. All during this saccadic duration, retina's neurons actually do respond. However, recent studies seems to suggest that during the saccade, retinal neuron also starts to show some kind of depression in terms of the sensitivity, but that's taken aside. Anyway, so the things that's going on at the level of the retina does not get reflected in our conscious experience. If it is a case, then we should see much more a blank of conscious experience. As I emphasized last week, we do move the eyes 3 times second, and also each of the saccade is accompanied by 100 milliseconds of the sort of the blanking of the sensitivity, and that's not really what we are experiencing. So retina, for example, is not the minimally sufficient kind of the mechanism. And the same goes for the heart, for example. Heart can be replaced by some other mechanisms such as artificial heart pump, and still we can see and also hear and experience without any problem. And the other types of the mechanisms that are removed by this type of criterion would be like prefrontal cortex or cerebellum and so on. They do contribute to the normal functioning of the brain and normal functioning of the consciousness, but if you give qualification of for a specific conscious percept or experience, and if it's a jointly sufficient, then it's likely that these mechanisms are not the part of the NCC. Okay. And then, but this level of the definition of NCC has encountered lots of criticisms and further refinement as the science of consciousness proceeded, arrived at the following refinement of the NCC definition. So first is full of the neural correlates of consciousness, full NCC, and that's the neural substrate supporting experience in general, irrespective of its content. So if the patient is awake and fully conscious, regardless of whether they are hearing or seeing, there should be neural correlates of consciousness that relates to their experience at that moment. That's the full NCC. The other one is a content-specific NCC, and that's that corresponds to the NCC I mentioned prior. The neural substrate supporting a particular content of experience, such as face, whether seen, dreamt, or imagined. As long as subject experiences, that content should be reflected by this content-specific NCC. Okay. So then the next empirical question is, how can we find the NCC? And as I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, this paper Frisk 1990 Trends in Cognitive Science paper contains quite a good hints about how to find the NCC. And so I recommend you to skim through it at least, and then to employ it for your final project. Okay. So what they did in terms of conceptually is the clarification of the neural correlates into at least 3 different components. So first is the neural correlates of consciousness. And the other one is the neural correlates of sensory stimulation, NCS. And then another one is the neural correlates of the behaviors. So physical input comes into the brain through the eyes and LGN and so on. And then initially, there is a neural correlates of sensory stimulation that reflects what's out there, in terms of the processing. And then that leads to eventually neural correlates of consciousness that gives rise to our conscious experience. And also, it also generates some kind of behavior, okay? And then from here, this figure looks a bit funny, but the neural correlates of consciousness itself can be also, preceding neural correlates of the behavior. And the behavior, I would actually count this verbal report or behavior report as a neural correlates of behavior. And then also other types of behavior. Here, their behavior means like eye movements or pupillary dilation or heartbeat or something like that. But these 3 components, if you distinguish conceptually, what we can do is to fix 2 while varying the only the rest of the 1 component, or fix 1 component while examining the relation of the 2. What I mean by that, so that's let's clarify that with the example. So here's a table 1 from their paper. The first table talks about empirical experimental paradigms, okay, in the normal subject, normal states, okay. And then here, the first one makes stimulation, NCS or NCB behavior remains constant, while NCC or subjective experience consciousness part changes, okay? And for example, in terms of perception, they suggested that we can study the neural correlates of binocular rivalry. We'll explain this kind of each of the phenomena as we go on, starting from this week and so on. And then also we can study neural correlates of episodic recall. So without changing stimulus or behavior, I can imagine, I can just recall what happened yesterday or what happened 2 days ago. And in fact, that visual imagery experiment for the vegetative patients that I covered in the early weeks is, in a sense, this type of the experiment. And then another possibility is this action, neural correlates of the awareness of intention. So here, you don't do anything. So the stimulus and the behavior remains constant, but you just try to think about or move about, okay? And recently, there was a very interesting study of the intentional internal speech, time locked with counter, like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then you try to say something, but just internally. And we can find the ERP evidence of internally time-locked speech, and the contents of that speech can be to some extent decoded as well. That's a very interesting paper. And then the stimulation changes while subjective experience remains constant. That's the opposite of what I discussed above, which could be the neural correlates of changes in stimulation without awareness. So we will go into this kind of paradigm in 2 weeks or so. One of the most famous example is change blindness. Even though the stimulus itself is changing, many of the subjects do not experience, there was a change. And some of the journal club presentation that you guys did in week 2 and 4 relates to this type. And also in terms of memory, neural correlates of unrecognized old items. So here you present different kind of stimulus. So the stimulus itself changes, but sometimes you see things that you saw before and then say that, no, I have never seen it, or the other side as well. So that's corresponding to or highly related to the situation of false alarm or miss in the signal detection task that I discussed, a couple of weeks ago. So in that sense, this side is roughly speaking, focusing on the mistake that subjects believe that is correct with a metacognitive, mistake. Okay, and then in terms of action, neural correlates of stimulus eliciting action without awareness. So here, present some kind of a priming stimulus or something like that. That you're not aware, but your behavior changes, and but you remain subjectively unaware of the stimulus. Again, some of your unconscious processing literature in the general club is categorized along this category. Okay, and then behavior changes while subjective experience remains constant. This is correct guessing without awareness. That's a blind side situation, or correct correlates of the implicit learning. That's also similar to blind side, but you can make an unconscious learning within the normal subjects. And also neural correlates of implicit motor behavior. Again, like a blind side situation in the normal subject. And then the next one is abnormal situation, abnormal states, like the ones that are reported by the patients or under the hallucination or something like that. Okay. So here, let's go with the first one. Subjective experience changes, and then stimulation of behavior remains constant. And then in terms of percept, you have a situation of hallucination, as I said, and also memory, cortical confabulation. So you don't have actual, events, but you feel like you had something. So deja vu would be something like this. And then action, abnormal intentions, delusions of control. So I might have mentioned this in the previous lecture, but there are cases of the Aryan hand syndrome, where patients report that your hand, her hand is moving regardless of her intention. We'll encounter some of these in later lecture in the split brain patient as well. And then another category, it would be stimulus changes, subjective experience remains constant. It's in a blind field in the blind side, and unrecognized items in amnesia. So here, amnesic patient who we'll cover in the later lecture, see the stimulus, and then they say that, no, I don't remember anything about this. However, they show some kind of behavior evidence to show that he actually likes this thing and familiar face that he saw before, or shows some aversions to things that were associated with, let's say, electrical shock and things like that. And then neural correlates of stimulus eliciting unintended actions, similar story. And then behavior changes, subjective experience remains constant, reaching from agnosia. So here, agnosia is a person who do not see the object, regardless of their ability to reach to the objects and so on, which we'll cover again 2 weeks from now. And then implicit learning in amnesia patient, which we covered already. And then neural correlates of unintended actions, similar story again. So all these numbers here in this table, something like this, is actually the reference number of this paper. So if you find all these entry interesting, then I would recommend you to go into some of these papers and then use the Google Scholar to find what's the latest thing that is known about this, neural correlate study, and then go from there for your final assessment. Okay. All right. So in summary, for this, first part of the lecture, I introduced the concept of the NCC, neural correlates of consciousness, and that's an empirical research program that has made a huge advance since 1990s. And Christoph Koch's review in 2016 brings updated notion of NCC. And there are many empirical approaches, as you saw in the last tables, some of which can be great inspiration for your final research proposal. Okay. So in the next part of the video, we'll go into the paradigm example of whether the NCC can be found in particular area of the brain, the B1.